friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
Well, welcome to the Rewind podcast. This is Kevin. I'm hosting for the first time. And to my right is Andrew, who typically is one of our key hosts, but he's on the hot seat today.
It's true. I'm ready for it.
Yeah, so I get to do a little bit of payback. And to my left is Kirk. And just so great to have you here today. And I'm excited to talk about what we're talking about here because, truth be known, in talking with you the last several weeks, is this particular sermon, Help Me in My Unbelief, was a particular challenge to you. So I'd like to explore that a little bit. But before we do, I think it would be good to get kind of that 1 to 2 sentence snapshot of, what is your sermon in a nutshell. So maybe we'll start with Kirk.
Yeah, for me, it was just this real story of a real dad who's going through a lot of chaos and a lot of pain and difficulties, and connecting the human reality that when we have those moments of unbelief, when we feel like there's no way God can come through, it's usually rooted in we've had all kinds of disappointments and experiences that tell us that that's the case. And just to be able to connect at an emotional level with this dad, but then to be able to hear the voice of Jesus that just keeps calling us back to no matter what's going on. I just love the way it finishes near the end of the story. There's this moment where it just says, but Jesus. Mm-hmm. And when all hope is lost, it's not lost when Jesus is involved.
Awesome. That was more than 2 sentences, but I'm going to let that one slide.
There's a thing there's a chalkboard behind the camera that people can't see. It says detention on the top of the
Yes, that's right. Although that could have been a run-on sentence, so you're good.
I'm like the Apostle Paul that way.
Your grammar's terrible.
Okay,
but
Kirk and the Apostle Paul. I got it. All right.
I'm loving this whole Kevin as host thing. I might just step aside and let you take the mantle.
Well, you're speaking too soon because you're on the hot seat right now, buddy. And 1 to 2 pithy sentences.
I wanted to capture also the human element of that father and particularly how he handled that doubt and brought it to Jesus.
That was
I could say more, but I'm not allowed to.
You're not. Especially you, Andrew.
Right.
I guess before we kind of dig in, let's personalize this a little bit because I'm curious to know why this particular message was a bit of a struggle for you. Because quite honestly, when I looked at it, I thought, that would be great to, preach on help me with my unbelief, because often that's something that's rattling around my mind. It seems pretty straightforward, but obviously not. So maybe share a little bit of your struggle, arriving where you arrived.
Yeah, for me, it was a real struggle because I started to go down a bit of a rabbit trail as I started studying this, and one thing led to another, which led to another question. And it really boiled down for me in the sense of what's the difference between doubt, unbelief, questions, and what does that have to do with this story? Like, what's the connecting point? Because it does feel kind of harsh at points where Jesus is like, yeah, you have unbelief. And meanwhile, my kid is dying, right? And so it just, I really had to wrestle through the understanding of the word unbelief combined with other words we typically use, like doubt and questions and faith and things like that.
Yeah, I find it interesting when preparing for a message. Often you start with that, point, and then you build out and you think, wait, this is getting out of control, and then you kind of have to bring it back to the point. I loved how you did that. Andrew, how about yourself?
I think there's a lot of wrestling for me personally. Like, I work with a lot of young people. So like I've had a lot of conversations, kids at developmental ages saying like, I'm not sure that I believe this anymore. And one of the things I love is like making space for doubt and struggling and wrestling with your faith. But again, that battle of like, what's doubt, what's unbelief or disbelief in what God said. So I love the idea of like trying to paint the picture of how the scribes, the disciples, and this father wrestle with those concepts. And I also like, there's a couple of scriptures that I ran up against, like where Jesus says like, "Oh, you faithless generation, how long must I bear with you?" Like, I remember it was probably 2 or 3 weeks ago when I was doing the podcast, and I was like, "Kirk, I don't get it." And he very graciously helped me. But there was a lot of like tripwires through this passage where you have to say like you can't blow past this verse, because if you do, it messes you up. So that one, like, "Oh, you faithless generation." And then Jesus saying like, everything is possible for those who believe, which has been terribly mishandled. And I told a story on Sunday about how I had a friend who was deeply wounded by that unhelpful and unbiblical handling of that passage. So there was a lot. I feel like I'm so glad that there's a podcast, because I feel like I probably could have done a whole series on like this one particular story. Yes. So there's a lot of wrestling, and I don't know that I could pin it down.
Well, it was very interesting. And I like how you started with, referring to Gen Z, is it? That is, basically a generation that's growing up with very little or no sort of Judeo-Christian framework. I thought that was a fruitful place to start. Now, it was very interesting watching your sermons and, taking notes. And it's almost like your outlines were inverted. Very different approaches. But one thing I thought very interesting is, Kirk, you started with getting open and honest with Jesus, and then you kind of concluded around the person of Jesus. Whereas, Andrew, you talked more about the person of Jesus at the beginning, and then you kind of near your conclusion was on getting open and honest with Jesus. So there's just an interesting sort of evolution of thought there. I'd be curious to know, what your thoughts are on that, kind of how you kind of navigated toward that, from that beginning to that end, and vice versa.
We just did it intentionally so nobody thought we were plagiarizing from each other's sermons. That's pretty much.
So basically one person.
That's right. That's exactly what we did.
I was on vacation, so I actually just took Kirk's notes and flipped them upside down and hoped that nobody would pay attention.
Well, that was good. Threw in an extra anecdotal points,
I think for me, in reading the story, I wanted to start, as I read through the story multiple times, what kept coming back to me was just this incredible human element, this human reality of this dad who was just dealing with so much difficulty. Even though the story starts actually with this picture of the scribes and the disciples arguing with each other, I still put the dad in the start of that story, and I was like, man, this got to be so frustrating for him as a dad, because you've brought your son to Jesus. Jesus isn't there. So you're hoping somebody's going to help him out. And all you get are two groups of people arguing with each other. And
that never happens in the church.
Never, ever happens in the church. And so when Jesus does step into the story, when Jesus does step into the picture, there's this reality of Jesus saying, "Bring the boy to me." And for me, that was that starting point of that invitation of like, you might feel frustrated. You might feel disappointed in Christians. You might be like, you've had it with church. You don't know if you believe any of this stuff anymore. But I want you to know that Jesus does step into the story, and he is inviting you to be honest with where you're at. And that's what he did for this father. He's like, just tell me what's going on, even though he's Jesus. So he knew what was going on. But like, there's just that open invitation from Jesus towards us being very vulnerable, very honest, with whatever we're feeling and experiencing. That to me is one of the great things about the gospel message is God's not afraid of our honesty.
And that came out, clarion clear in your message. I thought that was powerful. Andrew, how about yourself?
One of the things that I found incredibly interesting in my study was there's 3 parallel passages that tell this story, and there's this very consistent run up in all of the gospels that have this story of the same sequence of events, and it's this continued revelation of who Jesus is. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have this, like, the declaration that Peter makes that you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and then you get Jesus saying, like, I'm going to have to go to the cross and die and be resurrected and have hope, and then he goes to the Mount of Transfiguration and shows to the fullest extent before his resurrection of his full glory. And so you just see this picture of, like, Jesus coming into full view, which is why I sort of tried to start there, because I think you needed that picture, because that's where the passage has been taking you. And then you go into, like, so then here's where the rubber meets the road. Like, so now how do I wrestle with this reality of who Jesus is, and is he who he says he is? Because even his disciples keep stumbling over this reality. And I love that's this father who is like Kirk said, like, there's this, like, real raw human element of, like, I'm in pain. I've been deeply disappointed. I don't understand. I don't even know if I believe that you can do this, but I'm just going to come anyways. That I found, that's sort of why I wanted to move my sermon in that direction.
Yeah. And it worked. And I love how, both of the approaches uniquely worked, and they pointed toward the same thing ultimately. One of the key themes, of course, is the whole question of doubt, doubts and questions. And, certainly there was some overlap in the way you handled it, but you handled it uniquely and I would say very effectively. Kirk, you landed on kind of this idea that, you can either with doubt submit to your doubt, or you can submit your doubts to God. Maybe you could discuss that a bit.
Yeah, I think that whenever you're having doubts and you're wrestling with doubts or unbelief in your life, your head will start to play games with you. Like, you can stay in that space of those doubts and those questions and that sense of unbelief, and it's like a snowball effect. It'll just keep building and building and building, and you'll start to believe the next message, and then the next message, and the next message that goes through your head. And that's what it looks like to submit to your doubts, is you're just allowing this snowball effect to build in your life, that, the things that you would have never dreamt you would ever believe, suddenly you wake up one day going, yeah, I don't think God's real anymore. I don't think God could do this. But maybe 2 years ago, you were completely sold out for Jesus, and now all of a sudden you find yourself in a spot. And there's lots of people who are in that place.
Yeah.
I mean, there's lots of well-known people who are in that kind of place. Andrew, you and I have had lots of conversations about people who are deconstructing faith. And so there's that reality. But people don't wake up deconstructing their faith. They are constantly submitting to their doubts, and they're letting those doubts to begin to take over their life. And so you have a choice. Every person does. Like, do I let these doubts control the path that I'm going to go down, or do I take these doubts and surrender them to Jesus? And when you surrender them to Jesus, you are doing what this dad did. You're living in that space of saying, I do believe, but, like, I need some help here with my unbelief, to kind of point myself back in the right direction of who you are. And I love what Barnabas Piper talked about, that that trust is rooted in the character of God, not in understanding all of his reasons.
I love that
and a lot of times we try to make sure we understand all of God's reasons. You're just not going to understand all, because you're not God. So you can't understand all of his reasons. But there's so much about his character that we can understand that leads us back towards trust.
Yeah, and I love that. I often say it's not for us to know the mind of God, but it is for us to trust the character of God. And I think that came through so clear. And Kirk, I think, you kind of described well both how doubt can be used to drive us to the Lord, but also the danger of doubt. The very real danger. And we would all, identify people in our own lives personally, and then, of course, people that are a little more well-known who have fallen away because of, it's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts, that sort of idea. Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, Andrew, your tone toward doubt and questioning, I would say, was much more positive and affirmative. And I want to explore that a little bit, because we do come to that place. And of course, we see it in other passages of Scripture where Jesus calls doubt for what it is, whether it's in the disciples or in others. And, he can be somewhat, it feels a bit scathing sometimes. But what came through with your sermon is you were kind of encouraging doubt and questioning, but I'd like you to kind of
very fair. That. I think one of the things I wish I had done better was define terms, because I think there's a lot of, you can use things like doubt, unbelief, disbelief interchangeably. And I wish I had spent more time saying, this is what I mean when I say this word. So Jesus is really vicious towards unbelief or a lack of faith. And what I think in terms of like what I've uncovered in study and sort of preparing for this message was like, that's a lack of trusting in who God is. So you see that in him constantly like whooping the disciples with being like, you of little faith. The number of times he says that to people who are like literally following in his footsteps is outrageous to me. And then, so I would say that active not trusting of God in faith or Jesus in faith. So you see that in the scribes when they're actively seeking to just like dismantle Jesus' ministry, and they're saying like, I don't believe you are who you say you are. So I'm going to viciously strike out against that. And you see that in like the new atheists and those sorts of things, or some of those folks, Kirk, we've talked about, who are deconstructing their faith and being like, well, that was cute for me to believe as a child, but now I've graduated and I'm all past those belief systems. And the tone is like, it's not, I'm trying to seek understanding. It's there's a piousness to that that's unhelpful. You see in the disciples, as you often do in their narrative of following Jesus, that they make it about themselves, that they say like, oh, God has commissioned me to do this, so I'm going to go out and like muscle up and do it in my own strength. And, Jesus inviting Peter to walk on the water, same thing, like, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And so Jesus is actively calling out when you choose to rely on something other than him. Yeah. And that's why I found the picture of the Father so compelling, is because he takes that and he carries it to Jesus and says, I believe and I don't all at the same time, and I don't know what to do with this. So that's what I wanted to encourage, because I think far too often, even in religious circles, we don't necessarily do what the scribes did, but we'll do what the disciples did and say like, God has called me to do good things, so I'm going to go in my own strength with, some of the skills and even commands that God has given me, but I'm going to make it about me. And that's when things get real squirrely. And I think if we had some people in leadership who were far more humble and willing to wrestle with their doubts honestly and carry them to Jesus. I love that term that you used, Kirk. That's what I wanted to encourage. Not to be like, hey, you should doubt everything, right? That's not the tone I wanted to set, but I wanted to create space for doubt. I know. So from like anecdotally, the first person I ever led to Jesus walked away because of some really deep hurt from the church. And my best friend in high school, who we both came to faith about the same time, in university, went the whole way of the new atheist and said like, I'm sort of done with this. My thought process has gone past this like religious phase of life that I went into. And he's a very brilliant guy who I deeply respect, but also deeply disagree with. So I feel like stifling the ability to ask questions has led us to a really unhealthy space. And you see the like discomfort in, I've talked to parents and youth leaders and people who are wrestling with the next generation, asking questions about their faith. And we shut it down, not because we think it's unhelpful, but because we don't know how to deal with it. And then we've done what the disciples were doing and saying like, I don't have the answer here. So like, stop. And it's like, the whole point was to go to Jesus and to begin with.
Right.
Yeah, and I thought, and of course I'm playing the devil's advocate here because I'm just talking about tone. I thought that was, an excellent point you made as far as one distinguishing between doubt of the scribes and Pharisees and those of the disciples, and in this instance, the man. And the fact that doubt and his ability to openly express the doubt, I think that's where you landed.
Yeah.
And if we are open and honest with God, we will receive loving correction. And I thought that really came out well.
And I think, too, it's important for people to understand that questions are not the same thing as doubt. Because if they were, then Jesus sinned. Because Jesus asked questions.
Yes.
He's on the cross and says, my God, why have you forsaken me?
That's fair. Yeah.
And so asking questions is not a bad thing, and it does not equal doubt. So, you know, for people who are concerned that, oh no, my kid is asking these questions, that means that, like, I'm not sure that they're actually following Jesus. No, be open to the questions. Let them ask the questions. It's okay to ask questions.
It's good,
Yeah.
right? If you don't push on your faith, you'll never know it'll stand up.
Absolutely.
And if you're a parent listening to this, or someone, you know, who loves young people, like, those questions are coming, whether they're asking them or not. They
Right.
will be asked. And if you don't have space to wrestle with them in a safe environment where Christ is Lord, then you send them off to university or into the workplace, and people are going to ask those same questions.
Yeah.
If you've never thought about that before, people are losing their faith, not because faith isn't worth having, but because they're completely ill prepared for the hard questions that you have to ask.
Yeah.
So can we just hit a pause on this conversation for 1 second? Because I think that we're at a time of year where we have a number of students who are going off to school and into university and college for the first time for some of them.
Yeah.
And, you know, Andrew, you just gave a really good reality check of what some of them are going to walk into when they walk into their school environment. And I just think that, first of all, if you're a parent listening to this, let me just encourage you, like, you need to make sure you're doing everything possible to help your kids with their spiritual life now more than ever before. Especially if your kids are going away to school this fall, like, please don't just like go, hey, hallelujah, they're out of the house. But like, find ways to keep pointing them in the right direction spiritually and connecting them with places that they need to be connected with spiritually. And like, Andrew, I know you guys are working on something. So just give a plug for that.
We're plugging an online 6-week course that's going to be led by Travis and Caitlin Bowman. I always say it wrong. Bowman. Sorry, Travis. And we're just going to keep your kids connected to Forward Church specifically. And then we are strategically going to connect with those kids and try to connect them to faith communities in the cities that they're in. So if you have a kid going off to school this fall, connect with us. The announcements happened this past Sunday and will happen next one as well. We want to continue to help transition. I've used the term midwifing that transition out of this home church into whatever study environment they're going to be in, or if they're off in the workforce or whatever, but they're going to be in a new environment where they're disconnected from their roots. And that's when those blows can be so devastating and disorienting, right? Because you don't have something steady to fall back on, to go, oh, I'm just going to go sit and talk with my parents, or I'm going to call one of my pastors or have coffee with somebody that I know and has invested in me. So we want to keep that connection alive.
And this, you see, the great thing about podcasts is you can suddenly kind of curve off, and this has been very helpful. And I think, you know, in the words of Andrew, as a parent, don't freak out. And get open and honest about the Lord. And it's interesting that the spirit in this child in the passage in Mark is a mute spirit. And in a sense, what comes to mind is many times our kids are rendered mute in a culture that is so antagonistic toward faith. And we need to speak the living and abiding word of God into our kids. We need to pray for them. And most importantly, we need to model for them what it means to be in love with Jesus. And it comes back to both of your points. Andrew started there, Kirk concluded there, and that is, it comes down to the person of Jesus. We're talking about a real relationship. We're not talking about religion. But here, I want to, you know, we talk about, this is Dangerous Prayers. This is the series we've gone on. Help me with my unbelief. I think maybe, I don't know if we've addressed sufficiently, why is this such a dangerous prayer? You know, anyway, and it really came out in your sermons in a unique way. So Kirk, I'm going to start with you.
For me, it's a dangerous prayer because the dad starts where most of us start, and that is, God, fix the problem. Right? I've got this problem, fix what I think the problem is. And Jesus calls him out and says, your real problem is your unbelief. And it's a dangerous prayer because, in essence, you're actually inviting God to expose your heart. You are acknowledging the realities of what's really going on deep below the surface. And you are inviting Jesus to do heart surgery in you before he ever looks to address the problems that are around you. And that's not usually comfortable. And even for this dad, you know, and we talked about this on Sunday here in Cambridge, but for this dad, like, the story actually takes a turn for the worse for him because everybody thinks the son is dead. Right? So, you go down this path where you think Jesus is answering your prayer and you just look and go, well, that didn't go as planned. So you can imagine this reality where we always want God to fix the problem we see, and God always wants to fix the problem he sees. That's the reality. That's what makes it dangerous.
And I appreciate that. You, Kirk, you gave a devotional this morning that brings us back to the heart of prayer, which I think was really built out beautifully in your sermon. Andrew, how about you?
In terms of why it's dangerous, I like the two words that Kirk used there, uncomfortable and invitation, that it's Jesus inviting us to pray this prayer, to really lay ourselves before him, which is a little bit of the like, search me and know my heart early on, that like, one thing that I had in my notes a few more times than I actually said out loud on Sunday morning was that even our faith is something we need Jesus to heal. And ultimately, I think that's the beauty of this prayer, but also the dangerous nature of it, because we think like faith is a mechanism that we need to like animate in and of ourselves, that we need to just like have more faith or work up the faith to go trust God more. But even that, Hebrews 12 tells us that Jesus is the author and perfecter of our faith, right? Like, it's not something that we drum up within ourselves. And admitting that takes humility, takes us laying our hearts open before the Lord, and it's gut-wrenching to honestly stare in the face. We would much rather self-medicate or distract ourselves or, snuff out those conversations and questions, at whether they're coming from ourselves or someone else, and not really deal with it, right? How many times do you go home, you have a lot to deal with, and what you do is you like crack open the freezer, grab some ice cream, and watch some Netflix, right? Like, and we do that with our own souls.
Why do you have to get so personal? Seriously.
You've struck a nerve, Andrew.
I mean, turn on the Jays game.
There you go.
But we do that with our own souls, and I think what is the uncomfortable invitation of Jesus is to lay our faith, feeble as it may be, before him and ask him to heal it. It's a humble position to be in. And it's dangerous if we're going to pray that, and then if we're going to pray that as a church, because we're going to have people asking really difficult questions that we don't yet have the answers to.
So in both senses of what you've said is it leads us into the discomfort zone. And we don't want the discomfort zone. We want the comforts of predictability and affirmation of who we are. And prayer holds up the mirror to us. Don't like that.
It's deeply uncomfortable.
But so necessary.
But it's healing. I think that's the thing, right? Like, people, we run away from discomfort, but when you understand that the discomfort is meant to bring you to a place of healing, that's a different perspective. And I just want to say, like, I get it. I get being afraid of the discomfort of being exposed by God. But that's the story of the gospel. That's what the gospel does, is it exposes how sinful and broken and awful we are, but then says there's still hope. And I think this is really where this story lands for me, is that there is always hope when your hope is in Jesus.
I like that.
And hope, hope was kind of where I wanted to, where you both ended up with. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Can I touch on one more thing?
Oh, yes,
before we head in that
please
direction?
do,
So Kirk sort of like flirted with this line that I think both of us landed on, was that like, we don't like suffering, right? And this story is a story of deep suffering. Like, the human element of this father is like heartbreaking, right? This is a man who doesn't understand how to proceed anymore. He's gone to Jesus, and Jesus wasn't there. And then the people who were supposed to represent Jesus deeply disappointed him. And then instead of, when they couldn't heal him, didn't go like, oh, I'm so sorry. They went and got in an argument with some other people. Like, there's just like frustration and pain after frustration and pain. And far too often, people begin to disbelieve and have doubts when they've been hurt and experienced suffering. And it makes a lot of sense if you believe the gospel of comfort and convenience, that God doesn't love you because you're hurting. But when you read the pages of Scripture, it is so uncomfortably often that God uses pain and suffering and circumstances that we would never choose and never desire to shape us more into the image of Jesus. And if we don't begin to understand that as a church, we'll never really deal with our doubt, because our doubt often comes from pain. So if we ignore the pain, then we want to ignore the doubt because it brings up the pain. And we need to have a really far more fully orbed theology of suffering and how that is actually the way of Jesus, right? Like the Via Dolorosa, like that the way of suffering is also the way of Jesus, a man of sorrows, acquainted with suffering. You see that in the Apostle Paul, right? Like, who wants to sign up for that lifestyle? Multiple times shipwrecked and beaten within an inch of his life on multiple occasions. Prays that God would take this thorn away, and God says, no, I left it there for a reason, which is like the least comfortable response to prayer. I'd be like, sorry, I didn't hear you, Lord. Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
Don't.
Well, and your example was very fitting, too, of a friend with cancer and how her explanation was that she's never felt closer, more deeply in love with the Lord.
Yeah.
And I was with a friend this past week who has been through about 2 to 3 years of just a great deal of challenge, financial, family challenge and everything. And this man said he wouldn't trade it because God has been able to work on his character in such a way that, it's produced fruit that he wouldn't have had otherwise. And just a beautiful example of how the pain can lead to
Jerry, in our conversations, described this past year and a half of battling stage 4 cancer, bone cancer, that is incurable, as a gift. And I'm like, that is a miracle of God, that her heart would be so deeply transformed. And I can tell you, in early days, like, we shed a lot of tears and we cried out to God a lot and asked a lot of questions. But one of the cool things for me is, like, I've watched Jared do this, but then I've also watched Laura, who, like, Jared and Laura are like heart friends. And to see the transformation in my wife and her dependence on the Lord and her passion for the word and her pursuit of the presence of Jesus for her own sake has been incredible. So it's not just for us, that God will produce righteousness in the lives of others as we embrace the suffering that God sometimes places before us, maybe out of, maybe that's a result of sin. Maybe it's a result of just a broken world. Maybe it's a result of other people's sin and disappointment in our lives. And we don't often get the answer to why those things happen, but we can see that the hand of God can use those things to shape our hearts more and more to the image of Jesus.
And it comes back to Kirk's point, trusting the character of God, not knowing often the reasons of God, the mind of God.
Right. Yeah.
So hope. Andrew, it was an interesting, conclusion there, the way that in your, so you pointed out earlier on in your sermon, how people can be an impediment to faith. And many people, their doubts have come because of hurts from people. But then on the flip side of that, we see how people can be an avenue for God to use to bolster people's faith, leading to hope. Maybe you could just talk about it briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to hear a really cool story. Who's the doubter in Scripture that we all think of when we think of doubt?
Thomas,
right? Question mark. Right? Like doubting
It's kind of like being back in Sunday school.
Jesus. No, Thomas, right? Absolutely. He says, I'm not going to believe unless I can put my hand in his side and my hand in the nail hole, right? I was actually on vacation this past week. On Thursday, I was on the beach and I saw this group of very obviously Indian families. And one guy was wearing a underground church shirt. And so I was like, hey, had some conversations with him. Turns out his name is Jim. And we had some really good conversations. This entire group of first-generation immigrants from southern India, all deep believers who had prayed weekly together and had a meal together, and then God had scattered her out throughout southern Ontario. And they were gathering together at this beach that I happened to be at. And so I was like, oh, how did you guys all come to faith? And he said, we're all from southern India. And if you study the history of Thomas, he spread the gospel further than any other apostle. Southern India is a predominantly Christian area of India. And it's the Apostle Thomas's work that he carried the gospel the furthest after managing his doubts and saying, I'm not going to believe unless I see it. And God showed up in a really powerful way. So our doubts don't have to be this endpoint for our faith. It can actually propel us into a greater action, being greater conduits of hope when we wrestle with those things and we take them honestly before the Lord, and we don't subdue them and pretend they're not there, but we carry them honestly, trusting only in Him, and then the gospel can go forward and hope can arise.
I love it. I love it. Great story. Great story. Anything you want to add to that, Kirk, or anything that you wanted to?
I don't have nearly as good a story.
Well, make one up, for goodness sakes.
Here's where I think, for me, where it landed around hope. There's just that beautiful picture of these two words right at the end of the story where it just says, "But Jesus." And all hope was lost. This boy looked like he was dead. Everybody thought he was dead, but Jesus. And I think that is something I would hope everybody just holds on to, that what feels like the end of the story in whatever circumstance you might find yourself in is not the end of the story. Even death itself is not the end of the story because of but Jesus. If you were to study where this story fits in the life of Jesus, you'll find that Jesus is starting to move towards the end of his life. He's getting ready to go to the cross. And this was one of those moments where Jesus is actually preparing his disciples for when he wasn't going to be around anymore. And so in this moment, as he raises this boy back to what looks like from death to life, he is already beginning to give his disciples a picture of what he's about to do himself. Except in this case, he's going to do it on his own and not, somebody else coming to his rescue. And this, I think, is our ultimate hope. The resurrection of Jesus is our hope. I told a story about my nephew who had a literal death sentence on his life when he was in his mother's womb, and how God rescued his life. But what I didn't tell anybody was the story of my mother-in-law who passed away a year and a half ago, and the reality that even in death, but Jesus, right? The hope was always there. The hope was there whether or not my nephew lived or died. The hope was always there. And when my mother-in-law passed away, the hope was there. And it was tangible in the room. I can't even begin to describe to everybody how tangible it was. But so whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through today or 10 years from now, hold on to the sense of but Jesus, because the story isn't over yet.
That's beautiful, beautiful. And you think of, in light of all that's going around us in the world, and you can despair, or you can come back to those two simple but profound words. I love that. Andrew?
Yeah, I had a couple of really good books that I read as in preparation for this. So After Doubt by A.J. Swoboda, that was really, really helpful and helped really pull up that idea of we need to understand a theology of suffering. That was a really helpful piece I got from that book. And then also When Faith Fails by Dominic Dunn was a really good, it's a little funnier and a little more narrative. A.J. Swoboda is very much a Portlander. So it's deep thinking, you need a coffee and probably some sort of funky hat when you're reading that kind of book. But Dominic Dunn was a little more British and hilarious.
And I'd put a plug in for Help My Unbelief by Barnabas Piper.
Great. And I believe we will put those books on the Rewind podcast. How does that work?
Either show notes or in our 1 Degree Shift.
There we go.
Maybe both.
Maybe both. Sounds good. Any concluding remarks?
I think that's it. That's all I got.
Yeah, I really appreciated this passage, and I want to just encourage everyone. Again, don't be afraid when people ask the questions. Let's be a church where we keep praying these kinds of prayers with each other and for each other.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the Rewind podcast. And we always welcome your questions. So if you have any questions related to a message, we'd love to address them here. And the best way to do that is, I should know,
Derek F. at Forward Church.
Text Rewind to 226-212-7117.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew and Kirk, for joining me. And thank you for joining us and listening in. Have a great week.